So if you've been alive for any considerable amount of time, you might have noticed that around this time of the year there are a few traditions as far as movies are concerned. As a society, we tend to watch scary movies in October for Halloween. I have a list on that, and you should watch it. And we watch Christmas movies in December. I might just have a list on that as well coming up. You should also watch it. But you might have noticed as well, there's not that many Thanksgiving movies out there. I mean, when most people think of Thanksgiving movies, they generally think of the timeless classic, Thanksgiving, and I guess a few might think of Planes, Trains, and Automobiles also. And while these are certainly not wrong answers for the mantle of Thanksgiving tradition movies, I would love to submit a new candidate for your consideration. The other John Hughes road comedy that you may have never even heard of, Dutch. This movie is essentially the tale of working-class regular Joe Dutch Dooley, played by the wonderful Ed O'Neill, whose girlfriend Natalie has an estranged relationship with her silver spoon-fed, spoiled brat son Doyle. Doyle goes to a prestigious prep school in Georgia, and Natalie attempts to get her son to come home during the upcoming Thanksgiving holiday in an attempt to reconnect with her baby boy. Doyle says fuck that due to the fact that his mind has been poisoned by Natalie's douchebag ex-husband Reed, played by the wonderfully punchable Christopher McDonald, and he had been expecting to spend the holiday with his dad. Unfortunately for Doyle, the Reedster's got other plans, and not only isn't showing up, but he's left the thankless task of telling his son this news to Natalie. Dutch, seeing an opportunity to do a grand gesture for his girlfriend and his own opportunity to make a connection with her son, agrees to take up the venture of driving down to Georgia to pick up the boy and bring him home to, of course, where else did you expect it's a John Hughes movie, Chicago, even if it means kicking and screaming the entire way.
What do you like to do for fun? Well, you like to wiggle and grunt. Me too.
It's basically an alternate universe where Al Bundy doesn't marry Peggy and instead pursues another redhead whose ex-husband is alternate universe Shooter McGavin if he never went into golf. This alternate universe, or the Hughesaverse if you will, was confirmed by John himself when he said in a 1999 Premiere article that his movies do all exist within the same timeline. Movies like 16 Candles, The Breakfast Club, Weird Science, Ferris Bueller, The Vacation series, Home Alone, even Planes, Trains, and Automobiles all feature the town of Shermer, Illinois in one form or another. Shermer, Illinois is not a real place, anymore at least. It is based off of the Chicago suburb of Northbrook, where Hughes grew up in real life, which was once called Shermerville. We unfortunately never got any cross appearances for these characters, which in today's age of reboots and extensions of classic stories would certainly be a possibility. But for extra points, Claire's last name in The Breakfast Club is Standish, the same last name as Doyle and Reed. It's cool and also realistic to think that they are maybe cousins or something. Ethan Embry, the kid who would later play Rusty Griswold in Vegas Vacation, fun fact, plays the aforementioned Doyle, and the combo of the writing and his performance absolutely nail one of the most unlikable kids ever written. As an adult, you understand this kid has been raised this way and is a byproduct of neglect and loneliness. But even as a kid, I remember having moments of getting it. My parents were divorced, and I didn't see my father as much as I would have liked to, and I could put myself in this kid's position of rebelling against a new male figure in his life. Because, speaking from experience, most kids of a broken home desperately want to believe it will be whole again one day the way that they knew it. Then on top of it, he's physically abducted and forced to not only ride with, but also entertain this goofy motherfucker. Also, as a fun Easter egg, it's got one E.G. Daily, the future voice of Tommy Pickles, in it as a hooker. So have fun with that info.
Why are you telling me this?
Why would I not?
This movie has a poignant message about classism and placing wealth in life experiences and reliance on yourself, which is even more relevant in today's world, and knowing the way John Hughes felt about the ultra-rich, it's on brand. It has perfectly cast roles and is essentially a movie with all of the John Hughes boxes ticked. It should have worked and been held in the same sort of acclaim as his other holiday classics. But it just didn't. This movie bombed, but I've never really been able to see why, and that was something that I really wanted to try and answer. And what I found took me to an interesting place I didn't expect. To understand why this movie didn't perform well, we need to examine its creator and where he was professionally when it was conceived. Even if they don't realize it, any fan of 80s comedies will likely know the name, or at the very least the movies of, John Hughes. Hughes began his movie career while writing articles for National Lampoon magazine. His first screenplay effort that was adapted was Class Reunion, which was a blatant attempt to replicate the success of Animal House and largely went unnoticed. However, a couple of stories that he had written about funny personal experiences he had had ended up being on the basis of two screenplays that would go on to become major films, the original National Lampoon's Vacation and Mr. Mom. The success of both of these led to Hughes getting a 3-movie deal with Universal to try his hand at directing. The first of these movies was the universally beloved 16 Candles, which Hughes wrote in a weekend after seeing Molly Ringwald's headshot and thinking she was perfect for the character of Samantha, a girl who has her 16th birthday forgotten by her family and the hijinks surrounding this awful day. This gift for writing parts specifically for someone would later become a trademark, and Ringwald would continue to act as a career muse for him for several years.
We are the muses.
I mean, I was Josh Safdie's muse when he wrote Uncut Gems.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? Like things like that.
The success of 16 Candles launched the careers of both Hughes and Ringwald, and he would follow with another smash hit, 1985's The Breakfast Club, the story of 5 high school students with markedly differing social standings who were forced to spend a Saturday detention together and then come together to overcome their dickhead principal, was hugely relatable and continued to show Hughes' aptitude for writing those relatable characters. It also launched the careers of much of the remainder of the Brat Pack, the it crowd of mid-80s hot upcoming actors. The third film of this Universal deal would be Weird Science, the tale of 2 nerdy outcasts who create the perfect woman. It was a little goofier than the previous films, but it wasn't like committed to going full-on goofy, if that makes sense, and so it didn't land quite as well. But it was still a good time, and it was not enough to derail the success train. His next outing at director would be Ferris Bueller's Day Off, which some consider to be the quintessential John Hughes movie, the tale of a seemingly untouchable high school student's final chance to rebel against the system and impending adulthood as he cuts school with his girlfriend and uptight best friend to enjoy the best of everything the city has to offer while simultaneously avoiding the swinging axis of a humiliated principal and a jealous older sister. It's his love letter to Chicago, and it was wildly successful, launching the legend of one of the coolest characters ever put to film. However, in an effort to avoid being pigeonholed, Hughes chose to move away from the teen comedies with his next movie, as he wrote the aforementioned Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, which was the tale of 2 polar opposite men having to endure the annoyances of one another and the tribulations fate puts them through during a journey home for the holidays that is seemingly doomed from the start. And if you're starting to see the parallels in the stories of this movie and Dutch, congratulations, but we'll come back to that, I promise. This movie also marked the first major collaboration with the other person who became a Hughes muse, John Candy. These two would collaborate a few times together before Candy's untimely passing in 1994. John Hughes at this point had become a bona fide hitmaker, and although that comes with money, power, respect, and acclaim, it also comes with pressure, ego, and an increasing number of people trying to be part of what you have going. He had signed deals with multiple production companies by this time, and so the combo of the increased number of cooks in the kitchen and the growing reputation of the magnitude of his films would see a big uptick in studio executives attempting to get their opinions factored into the final drafts. Hughes had always considered himself more of a writer than a director, and he really didn't believe in writing by committee, so dealing with execs trying to put their fingerprints into and change his creations eventually took a toll, and he began to grow a distaste for directing. The problem was that nobody was better at putting his story to film than he was. In fact, with a couple of exceptions that we'll talk about shortly, nobody really ever had the same success of bringing a Hughes project to reality that he did. 16 Candles, The Breakfast Club, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and Planes, Trains, and Automobiles all worked so well because of that magic he brought and how well he knew the characters he created. Now, let's excuse from the discussion the National Lampoon Vacation series, which he did write the first 3 of, and which I don't really count towards this point that I'm making, primarily because the first Vacation movie became successful before John ever tried his hand at directing, and once it became a franchise, it developed its own identity. Let's also excuse Mr. Mom for essentially the same reason, apart from the franchise aspect of it. Apart from these films, the only 2 directors who were ever able to successfully bring his projects to life were Howard Deutsch and Chris Columbus. Deutsch had begun his directing career as a Hughes collaborator. In fact, his first 3 films were all Hughes projects: Pretty in Pink, Some Kind of Wonderful, and The Great Outdoors. And even though they were successful, they progressively were less and less so critically. Columbus had begun his career as a writer of movies such as Gremlins and The Goonies, but was unabashedly a student of John Hughes, and so his first crack at a Hughes-written project, the classic Home Alone, feels like a paint-by-number ode to his mentor, and that's part of the reason why it worked so beautifully. Despite it being the financially most successful Hughes movie ever, and spurring a sequel that Columbus would also direct, and that a surprising number of people actually don't care for. He wouldn't do well with the other Hughes project attempt in between these movies, Only the Lonely. So to recap, The most successful Hughes movies brought to screen by someone other than him were two directors who were outright students of his. Are we seeing a pattern yet? Sandwiched in between Deutsch and Columbus's directed efforts at his movies came two of his own, She's Having a Baby and Uncle Buck. Now, these movies have gone on to become cult classics since, but it's important to remember that at the time they were met with very mixed reactions. Planes, Trains, and Automobiles had established a new era of Hughes' writing, where he was successfully moved away from the teen comedies and into plots centered around more adult-themed situations. And unfortunately, these next two efforts just didn't deliver the same way at the time. John Hughes' best asset when it came to script writing was his heart. It's what allowed him to capture teen angst so well, even though he was about as boomer as you get on paper. He imbued these characters with that same heart, and his process was usually to take a script he had written and retool it once his character was cast to fit that exact person's flavor. And it worked magnificently to make you feel what these characters are feeling. The flip side to that is, when you put that much of yourself into something and it doesn't live up to expectations, the taste is extra bitter. Everyone wants to be revered and respected, especially when they have such quick success in a period where everything they touch turns to gold. When you add to that equation a particularly sensitive artist in a particularly tough business to survive in, the magic can turn to a curse very quickly. So, if you're John Hughes at the time, your once golden hand has begun to turn a bit green, and seemingly you've begun to plateau a bit creatively as far as expanding. Your most recent success has been a road comedy with two adults, but writing younger characters still seems to be your bread and butter. And you're coming off writing a movie where slapstick violence committed by a child on two dopey burglars netted you 6 times more money than anything you've ever done up to this point. And to add to it, you're just fucking tired of dealing with Hollywood at this point. What do? You create a movie that encompasses what in your formula has been successful recently. A road comedy that adds the elements of a well-written preteen character, and you stay as far away from directing it as you can, right? It's not hard to see why Hughes thought that this would work. I mean, it always had with his teen comedy movies. Tried and successful formula, tweak it a bit to fit the central theme of the story you're trying to tell, retool the dialogue and the mannerisms of the characters to fit the actors that have been cast to play them. Unfortunately, as we know, it didn't work. At least not critically or commercially at the time, and now we can begin to understand why. This movie suffered from a couple of major problems that hindered its chances from the very beginning, and one of them was the fact that Hughes didn't direct it himself. Deutsch would have been a fun choice just for, obvious reasons, and Columbus would have been fantastic too had he not been committed to Home Alone 2. Instead, though, the job went to Crocodile Dundee director Peter Feynman, and on paper, this might have seemed like a solid choice at the time. Crocodile Dundee was a fun movie, and it was his directorial debut. Perhaps this could be another director that Hughes could get some magic out of before he became co-opted by other Hollywood filmmaking influences. And to be honest, Feynman does an admirable job at making this feel like a Hughes movie, one of the last ones. Something was just missing though, and it's unfortunate that I think it's just a case of Hughes not being in the driver's seat. Later in 1991, we would get the final John Hughes directed movie, Curly Sue. This also bombed even harder than Dutch had, though time would be much kinder to it as well, but this sullied the last bit of reputation Hughes had and the last taste of directing he ever would. He would still continue to write movies all the way into the 2000s, even writing and pitching the original script that would end up retooled into the Jim Carrey version of The Grinch, but he would never reach the same heights he once had. It seems like time and the love for nostalgia of that period would have eventually served a way back into another successful run for John had he wanted to return, but sadly it was not to be. While out for a walk one afternoon in 2009, John Hughes had a massive heart attack and passed away at the age of 59. I don't know if it would have made any difference, but I can't help but to think about how differently things might have gone had he selected Dutch to be the movie he directed in 1991 rather than Curly Sue. It's possible that it still would have been incorrectly panned as a ripoff of his former more successful films, but I like to think that maybe the magic would have lasted just a bit longer had he picked this one. Which leads me to the other reason for it not being well received critically, its proximity to planes, trains, and automobiles. But Ed O'Neill, who was the obvious no-brainer choice to play Dutch, was at the height of his Married with Children popularity though, and the thought was likely to strike while the iron was hot. The movie does get a mention in an episode of the show where Al and Peggy go to rent a movie, and it gets the most Married with Children endorsement possible. There's also an argument for the fact that it's more character-driven than laugh-driven. It's not to say the laughs aren't there, but some are just a bit more subtle, such as the cooking scene in the beginning of the movie. Now, what we see is Dutch preparing a meal for Natalie while they discuss the prospects of him going down to pick up Doyle. Now, for the longest time, I never could understand because it looked like Dutch is just preparing this meal, everything goes in, and then all of a sudden, we see Dutch and Natalie sitting in a restaurant eating food. And when I was a kid, my thought process was, did they cook the food and then they took it out to a restaurant to eat? I never could understand. And then as an adult, I got it that that's the joke. He messed up the food so bad that they had to go out to eat instead. So it's just a little bit more subtle. You have to watch them once or twice extra to be able to understand them all. I'm not going to sit here and argue that Dutch is a better movie than Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. It isn't. But it's also not a knockoff of it as it was unfairly labeled. Sure, there are some recycled things from other Hughes movies, and the plot points that just generally go with road comedies are there, socially or behaviorally opposite characters, issues regarding the main method of transportation, necessitating a less than ideal path for the characters to have to endure, getting involved with the wrong types of people, being robbed, kids committing slapstick violence on adult, the center of the fucking universe being Chicago. It's there, but it's done in a way that is different and impactful to the story. Dutch could call for help anytime he wants, and they could be home quick and without issue, but that would be admitting defeat to not only his pride, not only the opportunity to create a bonding moment, but also to this little punk who is betting on him to fail. Doyle basically knows this the whole time, and he resents Dutch not only for the social status he represents, but also for bringing him along on this fruitless, and what he has already deemed from the start, pointless journey. This context makes the formula work because we're solving a different equation with it. The movie has some swervy moments too that some of the critics labeled as too unrealistic and not what an intelligent person would do, and to that I would say the context of the situation makes them make sense. I'm going to go into some of the scenes of the movie now, so if you haven't seen it and I've successfully sold you on it and you wish to do so without any detailed spoilers, I'll throw a timestamp up to the moment where you can skip to. Okay, here's your warning.
1, 2.
One of those swervy scenes in particular is after Dutch tosses Doyle out of the car, following him getting a lit cigar tossed in his lap.
Bitch bastard, you little son of a bitch!
Doyle starts heaving shit at the car from a nearby field he runs to, and Dutch threatens to leave him in the cold if he continues to do so. Doyle calls his bluff, and so Dutch throws him his jacket and says,
Here, I'll see you at the motel. About 50 miles down the road.
Wait a minute! Stop! I'll die!
Now, we're thinking we've seen this before in movies, and the next scene we will get is Dutch cooling down, feeling bad, and the car coming back into frame as Doyle walks along the side of the road. Nope.
You want to close the door?
I could have frozen to death, you asshole!
Here's something you should know about me, Dale. I don't screw around. You piss me off, I react. I'm not your dad, I'm not your grampy, I'm not your uncle. I'm a working class nobody. And I don't take crap from kiddies.
Then, as revenge, Doyle goes to get his bag from the car and decides to park it lengthwise across a 2-lane road. The car is smashed by an oncoming semi, and Doyle allows Dutch to think that he was in the car for a time before emerging to say,
I think this makes us even.
This provides the catalyst to make the journey even more difficult that we typically see in road movies, but it gives it a new element to that trope. It also is the trigger point for a really intense moment between the two that ultimately leads to a physical confrontation where Dutch mockingly allows Doyle to take his best shot, and Doyle proceeds to knock him out.
You got knocked the fuck out, man!
Now, I know this is super eyebrow-raising, but we have to remember,
I'm a high brown belt.
Yeah?
Yeah, I've been training for 3 years.
another good one is after the two have a scrap with a couple of security guards when they get caught trespassing. After narrowly escaping the situation, using some trickery that is admittedly a bit rough in today's world of undiagnosed mental illnesses and gun violence,
You don't have to shoot him! You don't have to shoot him, Pete. The kid is crazy. Don't be crazy, Pete. Don't be crazy, Pete.
I gotta do it. I gotta get rid of the vices.
Listen, it's the holiday season. These guys probably got family.
They stop inside of a restaurant hoping to get some help for Doyle's wound, and they are met with extreme hostility from the people who work there as being road people before a husband and wife get involved to use their powers as paying customers and stop the two from being thrown back out. And again, you think you see where it might be going, that these nice and seemingly well-off people are going to save the day and get our characters back to Chicago. Nope.
Well, this is a center for displaced families. Mike's supervisor is on the board.
So, good luck, all right? Don't give up, okay?
In short, instead of giving them some bus money or possibly even just driving them home themselves, they take them to a homeless shelter and drive off with a happy holidays that has all of the smugness and self-servitude of someone who video records themselves giving to the homeless.
It's not about me. Didn't think anybody would see this.
I am such a good person.
Instead, Dutch and Doyle spend the night in the shelter, and after some good stuff with each of them adjusting to being there, they find some help in the unlikelier form of a family who has been upended by the company they worked for going broke and having a run of bad luck. The family personally drives them back to Chicago in the car that they had apparently been living in and is barely being held together. This is the first glimpse we see that Dutch is actually a very successful owner of his own construction company, and he pays the husband of the family back by offering him a job. Again, just a nice little plot twist. We get the moments of overcoming adversity we expect, but Dutch and Doyle's coming together is gradual and begrudging for a while. This is really emphasized by two scenes. The dueling moments Doyle is presented with someone asking if Dutch is his father. The first is while being distracted by the big, beautiful, listening ears of one of the prostitutes that gives them a ride.
Nice tits, bitch.
Guy's not my dad, that's my mother's boyfriend. He's saying that, it's so sick.
This is all while a sleeping Dutch is being robbed by Tommy Pickles. After they're ditched by the girls, they have the customary all is lost moment where Dutch comes clean about the real situation they're in, and that he is officially tapping out. Doyle then attempts to contact his dad and realizes that Shooter McGavin has lied and is not on a work-related trip that he couldn't get out of. He's on a pleasure-related trip that he can't get out of. The realization his father has lied to him throws everything Doyle's believed to up to this point into question, and he begins to see the real error in his ways of thinking. After this, they bond over the Doyle getting horny and them getting robbed thing, having the altercation with the security guards, and then they end up in the homeless shelter, where we get the second of the moments I previously mentioned.
We got here tonight.
You and your daddy?
This non-correction is the only real moment we get of the future father-son relationship that could be there, but like I said earlier, that's not really the equation we're solving. This is obvious by the way the movie wraps up. We do get the touching moment of acceptance and unity that we have been building towards, but really the important one is not between Doyle and Dutch. It's between Doyle and Natalie. We have to keep in mind that Dutch's motive of bonding with Doyle might have seemed like the overall goal since we spent the whole movie with these two, but really the main goal was for Doyle to get a taste of reality, to bring him out of the worldview of a bratty child and into the worldview of a man who understands things aren't as black and white as they might have once seemed with his parents. He learns to respect people for the person that they are and not the number of commas in their bank balance. We get to watch him grow up in a lot of ways right in front of our eyes, and by the end we get the feeling that this very sharp and bright kid has been able to relocate his conscience. This is emphasized by his literal rejection of his father's attempts to reclaim his emotionally manipulative hold, and his acceptance of his mother. The other crucial deviation in the end comes from one other scene.
Excuse me. You wanted Natalie out by when?
Monday.
How's 6 months sound?
No problem.
And you're gonna work on being a nice guy with your son. He still loves you. It's a great kid. He doesn't deserve having his feelings hurt or his mind played with.
Now, let's not pretend for a minute that this actually would have worked. More likely, by the end of it, we'd be seeing signs for Reed Standish construction rather than Dutch Dooley construction. But ignoring that, the important thing here is the line delivered by Dutch.
I like him a lot. I'm his friend, but see, I'm never gonna be his father. That's your job. You better learn to do it.
Yes, sir.
If you have a stepdad, or are a stepdad, then you will know it's not realistic to immediately step into the shoes of being dad, especially when the child's father is in the picture, and that child is a teenage boy.
Robert better not get in my face, 'cause I'll drop that motherfucker.
The line, "I'm his friend, but I'm never going to be his father, that's your job," just proves that it wasn't really about trying to become a father figure. Or even if it may have had some sort of origin there, Dutch realized the more important role to fill was being a friend to a kid who desperately needed one. We can remember back to other moments in the movie to prove this.
I'm an interested third party. I'm a communicator. I'm a breakthrough kind of guy. I'm not your dad, I'm not your grampy, I'm not your uncle.
Parents don't always reach their children on the same level that a friend does, and now Doyle presumably has the best of both. To drive it home even further is the final scene, where Dutch finally pays Doyle back that pellet gun shot from earlier in the movie that has been a recurring joke. Something that maybe not a parent would force you to endure, but that a good friend might. So while attempting to understand why this movie didn't succeed took me to places I didn't expect it to, my overall point when I planned this out was to tell you to check this movie out if you've never seen it, because it deserves way more love than it got during its time. Hopefully you get as much enjoyment out of it as I always have.
You're like a great big demented child.
Also, I hope maybe you learned a thing or two about one of the greatest filmmakers of his generation. I could never have covered it all in this video, but if you want to dive more into learning about John Hughes, I suggest the documentary Don't You Forget About Me. It's much better at showing his entire rise and downfall. Thank you everyone for watching. I hope you like the different directions that I'm taking the channel in. If you think you have a good idea for a topic or an idea you'd like me to cover, let me know. Maybe I will. I would be thankful, see what I did there?
This guy sucks.
If you would check out the socials and do all the things to all the buttons. Got a couple of fun ranking videos coming out next in preps for the next Real Story episode, which promises to be the most fun one I have done to date, so definitely don't miss that. Anyways, be safe, be happy, and happy Turkey Day, everybody.